everyone, welcome back to another After Effects tutorial. In this video, we're going to take a look at motion tracking. We've got a couple different options available and we're going to touch base on the basics of each of these. Let's begin. So I'm going to start by dragging my footage over to create a new composition. And what we're going to be working with is this business card that's sliding into the screen. We're going to replace this with our own text and image and just make it look like it's our own business card. Okay, so we're going to be working in the tracker panel. If you don't have it up, you can go to Window and Tracker. And from here, I'm going to say Track Motion. Now you're going to see this little track point 1 show up. And he has a couple different jobs with him. So the middle square is the actual data that's going to be tracked. So it's going to track all this information. The outer square is actually the search area. So I know this card moves vertically, so I'm going to kind of make this into a little bit of a column. And then I'm going to make him a little bit larger too. Now the bigger you make these, the slower it's going to be because it has more data that it needs to track. Okay, so generally this probably would be good enough. Except I know that this card kind of rotates just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and include a second tracker by clicking rotation. Now it's going to give me the second track point. And what this does is relative to track point 1, wherever I'm tracking over here, however much rotation is occurring, he's going to track that data as well. So I want to do basically the same thing here, get my vertical column and my tracking data. Okay. Now under options on the tracker here, you got a couple different things. One thing you're going to want to set is normally it's by default can be adapt feature. I like to use stop tracking and I adjust my confidence to say 90%. What'll happen if you have adapt feature is that once the tracker can't establish the next track point location while it's doing its tracking, it'll actually start jumping around trying to adapt the feature. In my experience, you kind of run into a lot of issues. So if you have some low quality footage, you're going to want to make sure you stop tracking or else you're going to have to go back and clean up a lot of stuff. So we have all that set. We're going to go ahead and hit play, which is analyze forward. And that's going to track frame by frame on our track points until we get to the end. Okay, and since we did this in the middle, I'm going to start on where we just were. And we're going to go ahead and analyze backward. All right, we can actually just frame by frame and kind of see what's happening here. So you see it slowly tracking up on top of the screen. And then right when it gets to the edge, it's going to have some problems here sometimes. And so that's kind of the shortcomings you're going to see with the tracker is a lot of times near the edges, it kind of gets confused. It doesn't know where to track. The tracker is not the most perfect thing in the world, but it's a quick and easy job a lot of times, and it does a pretty well job. Okay. So now that we have that tracking information, what we want to do is we basically want to put this into some sort of controller. We don't want to apply this directly to our layers because it'll be easier to work with this way. So I'm going to right click and say new null, and I'm going to call this a tracker. Okay, and then back on my footage here, I'm going to hit edit target. Choose that tracker layer, hit OK, hit apply to X and Y. So what that did was, if we check our position and rotation for our tracker now, we get a whole bunch of keyframes. And this is all of the information of this null. And you can see it moving around here, with the exception of this first one that it kind of threw in there. Okay, just clean that up. And so you see it kind of jiggling around a little bit there, which is good because this card, along with the camera movement, is what we want. We want this organic movement that you normally can't get by hand-to-hand frame animation. You kind of have to do a good motion track. So now that we have this, let's see what we can do with it. So I'm going to make a new solid, and we'll make it red. And we'll just say like 200, and we'll make a little square. Okay, so what we want to do is parent this square to the null object tracker. Now there's two types of parenting that you can do really. When you click this and drag it over onto the tracker, now that object in its current location is going to track to the null. Now a lot of times you actually want to put this where the null was. So if I hold shift when I do this and let go, it actually will copy the position anchoring all that information of the null into that layer and put it in the same spot. Now the reason, like I said before, we want to use the tracker is now I can move this solid anywhere I want, and you can see it's still going to move relative to that null. Now I could do this for a whole series of things. Say if I had a text layer and we put it down, say here, we'll make it white. And then I go ahead and parent it to my tracker. Now when it moves, I'm going to get some motion tracking here with this text. And so I can position this anywhere on the screen I want, and I'm going to get that relative motion, which is really nice. If I've, say, tracked someone's head maybe, and as they're walking around talking, I can make text pop up as if they're saying it, all sorts of things. But in this case, we're going to work on our business card. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my solid in here. All right, and I'm just going to do a little trickery here by, I'm going to adjust the width. I'm basically want to match this business card. That way my aspect ratio and the solid looks pretty good. So I think we'll go about 600 and say 350. Okay, and that's close enough. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pre-comp this, leave all attributes. So now I have a pre-comp that's been parented to the tracker. So this pre-comp is going to follow along with that null still. Now the good thing is if I come into the pre-composition, I have this nice fresh composition here where it has no tracking data. I'm viewing it at the correct aspect ratio and everything. So right in here now, if I go ahead and add some text, I'll make this nice and big, and we'll align it right in the middle. Now when I go back to my business card, you can see it show up there. And of course, it's going to move because it's all part of that pre-composition. And so just like that, we've already got a nice moving looking business card here. And since this all has motion on it, I can go ahead and enable the motion blur for this layer, turn it on, and then now you can see we've got some motion blur going on in this text here, and that kind of gives it more of that polished look. I'm also going to clean this up by chopping this off by 1 frame here. Okay, so obviously we don't want a red business card, so we're going to go ahead and make this look a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to go view a new viewer. That way I have a side-by-side comparison here. Turn this off. Okay, so I want to get something similar to the business card here. So I'm going to go to where there's no shadow. So I'm going to get rid of this text, and I'm going to change the solid using the eyedropper and just pick one of these colors. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of grain dust going on here, and ours is very smooth. So we're going to add some noise and grain, add grain, switch this to final output so we can see all of it. Looks a bit much. Let's dial it back down a little bit to about 0.5. Grain by default is going to animate, which I don't really want, so I'm going to take the animation down to 0. Okay, so now we've got a nice looking business card. Okay, so if we go back and turn our layer back on, you can see it's starting to kind of look like a business card. All right, so let's go ahead and add a couple things on here. So text, let's just put edit, and we'll make it black. Put that up in the corner. And just give myself a little tag here. Okay, and put this up in this corner, and then we'll just say After Effects. Okay, and we'll line that to the bottom. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and bring in our alien here. Looks good. Looks like he's kind of intercepting a little bit there. I'll make him a little bit smaller. Okay, and then just for fun, let's say stylize emboss. And let's give them like a 10. And then let's also make them black and white. Okay, that way it kind of looks like it's pressed into the card. Okay, so we've had all that stuff. And of course, it's going to translate out to all the motion track stuff we've already done. So we get all the motion blur there. And remember, we haven't done anything more with any of our tracking information. We've done it all in our composition here, which is the beauty of using pre-comps with trackers. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The only other thing we can really do then is say add a mask for his fingers. I don't want to get too in depth in this, but let's get an idea here. So let's go pen tool, make sure Roto Bezier is on. And I'm just going to kind of trace his fingers here that I can see. Okay. And then we want to turn our mask feather up just a little bit, switch it over to subtract. Okay, and then we're going to do some motion path on it. So let's Go ahead and keyframe the mask path here. And it looks like he moves up a little bit, and then he's off screen. Okay, so set our layer back to 100% opacity. So now we have him come in there. His fingers are kind of getting masked out of the way. That way it looks like he's actually touching the business card. And I don't want to go too much into this. Some other stuff you could do probably is in the original, you see we've got some shadows going on here. So we can add a black solid, lower the opacity, and go ahead and do some masking and some animation on that. Maybe change some of the brightness, contrast, you know, whatever cleanup efforts you'd like to do. But we've basically seen here how to use the tracker panel to track a nice high-low contrast area and get ourselves some good motion tracking. So now that we've been introduced to the tracker panel, let's take a look at one of the other options that are available to us. So I'm going to use a scene here where James Bond takes a look at his cell phone, and we're going to replace the message on the screen here, which is great for this next tracker because we've got basically a rectangular shape and we've got really good high contrast here between the dark and light colors. So I'm going to go ahead and click track motion, and I'm going to choose track type. Instead of transform like before, we're going to say perspective corner pin. So we're going to get 4 track points, and these basically represent the corner edges of our square or rectangle or whatever we're tracking. This is useful for, say, a piece of paper, a cell phone, TV, any type of screen type replacement you want to do. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, right when he first sees it in the frame, and I'm going to put these on each of the corners. Okay, so we'll put this one here, and this one up here, same here, and same here. Now there's not really too much movement, but just to make sure, I'm just going to blow these up just a little bit. Okay, so we're going to make sure our stop tracking is set and track on through. You can see as the cell phone's moving, the track points are trying to keep it steady. Okay, so the screen went black. That's fine. That's all we want. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new solid. And just to start, we're just going to make it 100, 100, make it white. Okay, I'm going to edit target, set it to my new white solid, and now I'm going to apply that information. Now the difference between the other one is that applied position and rotation, because the 2 trackers we did. In this case though, it actually is going to apply an effect called corner pin, which is going to stretch the edges onto all of our track points. So if I click on corner pin, you can see these are all the information. You can see all the effect values up here. And so it's basically a series of tracking points on the screen here. Now we want to do that same trick we did before. We're going to go ahead and turn this off, and temporarily I'm just going to rotate this, and I'm going to adjust the width just to make it a little bit bigger. And I'm just trying to kind of match what we're working with here. Okay, that looks good. All right, so we want to, so since I did that, I'm going to have to go back now and reapply the data, because the composition size changed. And so if you do change it, make sure you go back and reapply it, because all the corner pin stuff is based on the original composition sizes and everything. Okay, so you can see he looks at his phone. We get a screen here. Okay, so I'm going to try to get the same color here. We'll go with, say, this nice blue. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this. Now I want to leave all attributes. This includes effects and everything else like that. So in this case, I want my corner pin effect to stay on this level. If I do move all, you'll see why this is a problem. It's taken the corner pin and actually put it inside this composition. So now we've got something like this, which isn't very good because I can't edit this very easily. So I'm going to undo that. And instead now I'm going to pre-comp it and say leave all. So the corner pin will stay on this level, and it's just going to take our solid now down to its own composition. And again, now this is nice because we can just work right inside of here. And I'm going to say warning. Send this, and we'll go Bank Gothic. It looks nice. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and add a stylize strobe. I'm just going to use the strobe's options to make layer transparent. So what this will do is it'll basically run a strobe light and make it transparent whenever the strobe runs. And so I can kind of get this little flashing effect. So when we go back to our main comp here, when he looks at his phone now, it's telling him that there's a warning. And so you can do a couple little things here. You see on the edges, it's obviously curved. So I can actually go into the pre-comp here and I can come up and say a rounded rectangle. While I have this selected, I'm going to hold Control and I'm going to double click. And this is kind of going to give me this little mask around the edge here. And so to make it a little bit nicer, we can just kind of feather that a little bit and then maybe bring the edge back out just so it kind of fits in there nicely. There we go. Okay. So all of our tracking data, now in this case, we're not using a null because with the corner pin, it's actually an effect and it's much more difficult to utilize a null when you're working with effect data, whereas before we had position and rotation data. So I've actually applied this directly to our pre-comp. And then here is where we're working with all the data. And so corner pin effect is going to put all the stuff in the location. We can change whatever we want, trim the clip, and then that's all we need to do. Like I said, we can do this for a computer screen, a piece of paper, kind of any type of rectangular object. That's where most likely this will come in handy. And again, that's using the tracker with the perspective corner pin. So we've seen some of the traditional tracking abilities using the tracker panel in After Effects here. What we want to do now is take a look at a little bit more of an advanced tool. In this scene, Natalia comes into the room with a bunch of computers to start working on them. What we want to do is replace what's on this far right monitor over here. First thing you might notice is that as the camera pans, it's going to clip the monitor right off the screen. If I were to use a perspective corner pin tracker here, the second that any of these corners exits the footage area, the tracker is not going to have any more information and it's going to basically break the geometry that we're trying to track. So we need to use a much more powerful tracker. In this case, we're going to end up using Mocha AE. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the layer, choose Animation, Track in Mocha AE. Now the screen that's going to come up will contain information about our footage, the frames, the frame rate. I recommend that you use the smallest clip you can. You can't really do any clipping or trimming of the layer ahead of time. Mocha is going to try to look at the entire layer. So try to utilize a layer that's small and that has all the information that you need and then bring it into Mocha. It's very touchy on how you have your thing set up. So this all looks good to me. I'm gonna hit OK. There's obviously a lot going on in here, but we're just gonna do some of the basics. I can click anywhere in the timeline here and scrub through. I can use scroll up and scroll down mouse. I can hold Z, zoom in and out, and I can pan around with the middle mouse button. So the best way that Mocha works is to go ahead and find a frame that's very clear and it's your starting point on where you're going to track. And we're going to track forwards and track backwards. So this frame right here looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and draw my mask around the monitor that I want to track. So I'm going to come up here to my X-Spline layer tool and I'm going to start left clicking a couple of points around the monitor. When I'm done, I can right click and then make some final adjustments. This isn't actually the corner pin tracking. This is the tracking area. So as long as it's around the monitor, this should be more than enough. We can even view our tracking area. You can see that looks pretty good there. It's going to catch all these edges, which should give it some really good tracking data. Okay, now if we show planar grid, this is actually in correspondence with the corner pin track data. So obviously this is incorrect because the planar grid is just facing straight onto the camera. So we click the next button here, we get the planar surface. So we want to put this right in the corner, and this represents the location of our corner pin data. So I'm going to put these at the corner of the monitor, and as I'm doing this, you're going to see the planar grid start shifting around. Now it's at the corners here. The planar grid looks pretty good. It's actually facing left and slightly upwards, just like the monitor. And so this is how we know that our information is accurate as far as Mocha is concerned in its 2D, 3D space here. All right, having done all that, we're going to go ahead and click track forwards. Now, as this tracks, we can stop it at any time if we want. We can readjust some of the tracking information here by moving these handles, which will drop keyframes. Although I don't need to do that because this thing's doing just a fine job. So I'm going to continue tracking all the way until it goes off the monitor. Now you can see already how well it's continuing to track the geometry of this monitor, even though it barely has anything left to track on. So once it's off, I'm going to go ahead and stop it. Of course, right at the edge, it kind of jiggles around a little bit, but we get pretty much all of the monitor the entire way, which is great. So I'm going to come back to my starting keyframe and go forwards now. I'm sorry, backwards. And we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. And we're going to let this track up until it's off the screen. And we can go ahead and keep our planar grid on the screen the whole time. That way we can make sure nothing weird is happening while the tracker points are moving. Okay, so we've got some really good tracking data here. Next thing we want to do is come down and go to export tracking data. We have basically two options here, corner pin or transform data. Transform data is useful if you want to track, say, someone's face or a moving object somewhere, because this gives us position, scale, and rotation. In this case, though, we are doing some corner pin because we're doing a monitor replacement. So we want to choose the one that supports motion blur. This will include the same type of information in transform along with corner pin, which will allow us to enable the native motion blur in After Effects. So I'm going to copy to clipboard, come back to After Effects. Now this is very important. I have to go back to the first frame because in Mocha, you'll see we've got these inner and outer markers that you can move them around, but if you just leave them by default, it'll be the first and last frames. So I want to make sure I'm on the very first frame. I'm going to create a new solid and make it comp size. Also very important. So now that I'm on my first frame with my new solid selected, I'm going to paste. If I look at my settings here, I have a corner pin effect that's been added along with some position, scale, and rotation information. This means that if I now enable motion blur on this layer, I'm going to go ahead and get that movement into motion blur, which is great. So we got this great track here. You can see our solid has been adjusted after I do a RAM preview here. And so the corner pin data has basically brought the solid into the corners of the monitor. In this case, we do need to do some slight adjustments here. Let's go ahead and slightly increase our size and maybe just move the position over just a little bit. Okay, that's fine. All right, so you can see in a matter of minutes, we've already got a really good track right into that screen. And it's actually pretty accurate, up all the way and past when it goes off the screen. It's pretty incredible. Okay, so now we want to start doing some modifications here. So first thing I'm going to do is change the color. Let's go ahead and match this navy blue. Okay. Then I'm going to go ahead and pre-comp this. Make sure you leave all attributes. We want corner pin to always be on the top level. Okay. Now we go in here, and what's the first thing we're going to notice? This is a rectangle, even though this is going on a square. And that's because this was our original comp size. So if I create a new solid that's a square, go ahead and make it red. So I've got a nice square here. Now when I come back here, what am I going to see? I'm going to see a squish square. What's going on here? Well, if I uncheck corner pin, you can see everything looks fine, but corner pin's taking the corners of that layer and it's putting them up in the corners here. So essentially I'm taking my rectangle and turning it into a square, which is then going to squish everything inside. So this becomes difficult to work with. A little trick that we can do, we can actually see in here too, if we stretch this out and go back, it'll start looking more and more like a square depending on how much we move it. All right, let's undo that. Now what I can do is pre-comp this layer, okay? And then I'm going to go ahead and just have this layer grow. So I'm going to do Control-Alt-F, which is the same as layer transform fit to comp. And this is going to make it the full size. And so when I go back now, he'll be the full size. Now the good part about doing this is I can go into this composition and now I have my native resolution here. So I have my original square. So if I add some text here, okay, this is our working layer. Here's our size adjustment layer. And here's our final comp. You can see it looks really good. So let's go ahead and do a couple adjustments here. I'm going to get rid of this. Add a new black solid. I'm going to say text numbers. Go Bank Gothic, left align. We want to say hexadecimal random. And we'll put him right there. We'll go ahead and duplicate layer. And move this one down. Okay. Duplicate again. And move him down. And then I'm going to go ahead and just offset these a little bit. All right, so this is basically what we've put together here. Some moving numbers. And this is all transparent background, so it's going to go ahead and filter up to this layer, which is using that nice royal blue that we made. And since it's moving kind of fast, I'm going to go ahead and say time posterize and put it just on 16 frames. That way the numbers move a little bit slower. So I'm going to come all the way back out here. Go ahead and RAM preview this. All right, let's zoom in a little bit and let's take a look. So we've got motion blur turned on, which is really important because if we look like, say, right here, if we don't, you're not going to get that nice motion blur that you would from the camera movement. So there we go. We've got our screen replacement. We've got our numbers moving. Of course, you can put anything you want there, an image, another video file, perhaps any type of animation that you can come up with. And it works really well because all the corner pin data is on the top layer. The intermediate layer is obviously doing our stretching and sizing, and then our inner layer is the one that we're actually working on. And so that's a good way to do a screen replacement using a Mocha AE. We've taken a look at some of the 2D tracking capabilities available in After Effects. Now we're going to take a look at some of the 3D tracking. In the scene here, this gentleman is trying to get inside the mall, and I want to go ahead and put a small message here on the window. And I'm going to do that with the 3D camera tracker. So we're going to go ahead and click on our footage, go to animation and say track camera. First thing we need to do is scroll down advanced and say detailed analysis. This will take slightly longer but give us much better results in our tracking data. So what's going to happen is that while this is going, and I can even pan through here, in the background, it's going to analyze each of these frames one by one. When it gets to the end, it's basically figured out all the tracking information for this scene. It will then need to create a camera, which we'll be able to use later on to create and simulate our 3D movement around the layers that we'll be placing in the scene. Now that that process is completed, the first thing we want to check is our average error. As long as we're under 1 pixel, we're in good shape, and at 0.78, we're just fine. So let's start scrolling through here and seeing what we got. We're going to see all these X's popping up all over the place. Now, the larger an X is, the closer it is to the camera, while the smaller is the further away. So we want to make sure that when we're choosing track points, we're choosing ones that are appropriate to the distance from the camera. If I choose one that's all the way in the background here, it's not going to have the right movement that I'm looking for if I want to put something on, say, the entrance right here. So it's definitely very important to understand the size differences in these X's. We can also adjust these relative to each other if we are having difficulty seeing the information. We can also do the same thing with these targeting windows. We can make them a little bit larger. So the way we use this is that each of these represents a piece of information or a group of pixels that the camera tracker was able to determine the movement location of. And so since it can understand how this is moving and changing, we can utilize this for our tracking information. So in this case, we want to work on this small window area right here. So I can either just choose one of these track points, left click, and then I can right click and create my null, but I can also try to do a section which will show up this bullseye. And what it does is going to take 3 track points kind of in a triangular fashion and show you a bullseye that is going to be the representative angle of those 3 track points. Now, the tricky thing is actually finding one that will point in the right direction. If I just chose one right in the middle here, these are obviously pointing all over the place and not actually facing the same direction out that the window is. So since I don't really like any of these, I know that these corner points got pretty good tracking information on them, so I'm going to go ahead and choose those manually. So I'm just going to left click, hold shift, and then choose all these ones that look the same size to me. And after just picking those 3, I can already see I have a bullseye target that's pretty much in the correct perspective angle of the window. And so this, I believe, will work very well. So we'll go ahead and right click and say create null in camera. So this gave us 2 new layers. We now have a new camera in our scene along with our track null. The new camera, if you look at its information, has a whole lot of position and orientation changes. If we look at the 4 views, we can see in the top, front, and right that the camera is basically moving around in 3D space. It's actually simulating the same movement of the camera in the footage itself. The track null actually doesn't move at all. The camera moves around the track null. So at the beginning here, if we look at the blue arrow, which represents the z-axis, this is facing away from the window. The angle here you'll see changes over time as we move further and further to the side of the window, and this represents a good track. So for example, let's add some text here. We need to make it 3D, and then I'm going to hold shift when I move to the track null, that way the position gets copied and it shows up on our window. Then we'll go ahead and bring up the size of it. And at this point, we can even move it around. Okay, so after we've done that, we now have text here on the window that you can tell the perspective angle of it's changing as we move around. And this is exactly what we're looking for. Here, the text isn't quite as squished as it is over here because the angle of the window has changed now that we've moved around it with the camera. This is the basis of how the entire 3D camera tracker works, that it will simulate that movement and allow us to place objects in 3D space in the scene and simulate what looks to be an object that actually existed in that footage. So for example, let's go ahead and make some modifications here. We'll say sight down, and we'll bring in our image. All right, make it 3D, parent to our track null, and we'll grow it in size. Move it down the window a little bit, and then we'll bring our text and put it right below it. Okay, so that now makes it look like we've got this small message sitting here on the window. And to make it a little bit more interesting, let's go ahead and change the blending mode of these to screen. That way we get some of our background colors. This will kind of give it a futuristic LCD type message. And we'll also do our strobe light trick on transparency. Copy that to the image. Okay, so now it looks like we've got a LCD projection of this image and text right here on the window. And as the camera angle changes, again, these objects don't move, the camera moves around them, but it basically simulates what it would look like if that image or object actually existed in that scene. Let's go ahead and take a look at a more advanced example of the 3D camera tracker. In this scene from The Matrix, the camera pans nearly 180 degrees around a telephone that's sitting on a small desk. So this is a good opportunity to see just how powerful the camera tracker is when we get this amount of movement. Another issue we're going to take a look at is the fact that this is a rather dark scene and the table itself, it doesn't have a whole lot of contrast. So as a baseline, let's go ahead and get started and just go and add the camera tracker here and let it do its job and see where we get from there. Okay, so now that the track's done, we'll take a look at what we have here. I see we're getting a lot of good information on the phone, and then we have some information at the beginning on our desk area, but as we get further away, it just can't determine what's changing here, and so we're not getting any track points. Now, another thing I'm seeing is we're getting a whole lot of track information on the actors in the background. So what's happening is that the camera tracker is trying to figure out what's changing, and it will focus on certain areas. So right now it's seeing a lot of information in the background changing, and it's not caring as much about what's happening up front. And so this is going to cause us an issue with trying to get a lot of good tracking information up front. So what we actually want to do is not track anything in the background here. We want to just track the phone. So in that case, we're going to have to do some masking on one of the footage layers that's being tracked. Now, unfortunately, you can't actually do the mask on this layer that has the effect. Instead, we're going to have to go ahead and pre-compose this. We're going to leave all the attributes, call this mask track. Okay, and then we'll go into this layer. Now in here, we're going to go ahead and just create a nice little mask around the phone. Okay. And this to just limit some of the information that's being tracked. I almost want to not include them as much as I can. I'm really only concerned with the desk. The phone is good too because there's a lot of good information that the tracker can use there in relation with the desk. So we'll go ahead and just do some mask path here. Okay, so now we've got the background information is pretty much all transparent. So the tracker shouldn't waste any time looking at any of that information. So it's going to spend all of its computing resources on just the desk and the phone. So we come back out to the main comp here. We're going to go ahead and reset. And we'll see what we get with those changes. As we take a look at the track information we're getting here, we're still not seeing a whole lot on the desk there. Pull these up a little bit. Seeing some on the phone, but it's definitely not looking in the background anymore. So it's going to start focusing on just the foreground, which is much better. Now, what the problem is that this scene is just way too dark for this tracker to figure out what's going on. So just in the same way that we modified the information that we want to track, we can do that with the brightness as well. So we're going to come back into the layer that we had the track mask on, and I'm going to say color correction and add curves. Basically, I'm going to do a contrast curve here, which if I turn this on and off, you can see it's just going to kind of blow out some of these colors, make the brights a lot brighter, and just add some contrast. In addition to that too, I'm going to also just bring up the contrast in general and then play around with the brightness and play around with the contrast a little bit until this kind of has a good set of color distinctions between all of the pixels next to each other. So now this looks much better in terms of visibility on what's actually happening. So if I come back out to the main layer, we'll reset one more time. And now we'll take a look at the track points we get. And suddenly we're seeing a whole lot more tracking information showing up on the desk now. So we're no longer looking in the background for any of the track information. And we're also looking at all this great contrasting information that's showing up on the desk. And so by modifying the underlying layer in a pre-comp, we can then track on just that set of information. So if I wanted to track, say, the people in the background instead, I could also just get rid of the phone. That way I get better tracking information for the background. In this case, though, we want to put some text here on the table next to the phone. So any of these track points down here would be pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and choose one of these, create null, and then let's add some text. Make it 3D. Again, parent to the track null. And then we'll increase this in size. And then we'll take a look. And we'll move them over a little bit. So there we go. So let's see how this actually looks. Let's go ahead and bring him up a little bit. And we'll call him camera tracker. And just make it close there. Switch fonts. Okay, now we don't actually need this scene anymore. We have our track information. So I can go ahead and bring my original scene back in and just hide the mask track. So now I've got my original scene with my camera tracker text here. And you can see it just kind of floating there next to the phone as we pan around. So what we can actually do is duplicate this layer. And we'll come right to where he's facing directly perpendicular to the camera here. And we'll just move him back a little bit. And then we'll also switch his color to, say, a light blue. Duplicate that layer again and move it back just a little bit more. And then we'll make him a darker blue. Okay. So now when we go ahead and render the scene out, we're kind of getting an idea here on the actual 3D data that's taking place. So the camera is turning around and our font is actually maintaining its 3D perspective position while the camera moves around it. And so if we had some sort of 3D objects in here, we could plant them right to the desk and then use the track null information to move around that object and make it look like it's actually sitting right next to the phone. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something about motion tracking today.